David, it's a question I've been being asked for many months about exactly what transpired between you and Field and I that resulted essentially in the breakup of Abel Danger. I admit I'm vamping here for a moment while I get everything set in the last seconds. Hello, David. How are you?
Hello, Jason. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. I hope everything is working properly and that we're live right now. I think it is. So, David, it's a question that comes up all the time. People know that for many years you and Field McConnell did essentially a radio show, a podcast, whatever we want to call it, called Abel Danger, and that no longer happens. You and Field aren't really speaking anymore. What would you like to say about this whole thing?
Well, just to run the clock back a little bit prior to my meeting Field McConnell on the telephone on the 6th of December 2006. Prior to that, I'd had an appearance with George Noory on Coast to Coast on September the 11th, 2006, where I'd explained my theory of the use of incendiaries to bring the towers down. And that was very well received. Someone who I believe used to work in the CIA nearly drove off the road when they heard me explain, and I do have a background with explosives and incendiaries, not actually blowing back buildings. And so there was a lot of interest, and there's a terminology that I'm now getting increasingly familiar with. As you approach the heart of a conspiracy, let's say the one that perhaps JFK was describing as we are opposed by a ruthless monolithic conspiracy, that uses guerrillas by night and armies by day and infiltration instead of invasion.
Right.
The conspirators will try and organize a trap, which apparently the modern, well, not the modern terminology, but the terminology is a sandbox, into which the people that they fear the most, who might unravel the conspiracy, are tempted. So after my introduction to Field by a pilot whose name was Dan Hanley, we started to talk, and I was looking at the time for what could help me articulate into an American audience so that they didn't have to listen to a guy with a funny British accent. They wouldn't necessarily relate to someone who might expose the people behind 911. I was looking for a pilot who was familiar with maneuvers, military maneuvers and civilian maneuvers, who might be an American pilot, who might be able to articulate my arguments and share that with an audience in the United States. And fortuitously, Dan Hanley introduced me to Field McConnell, who became a marvelous friend, and I'm still a friend of his. And we started working on articulating the argument that I'd developed, that the planes would actually flown through remote technology on 911, and the buildings were brought down by pre-positioned incendiary devices in the elevator shafts.
Right.
And Field very kindly shared with me many of his insights. He had 23,000 hours of flying experience, a long time, he's a Marine Corps vet, Marine Corps pilot, Navy pilot, and his contribution in terminology or terms like check turns. I hadn't heard of that term, but when I saw that second plane go into the second tower, it banked and smoothly slid into the tower. And I felt as an engineer that was rather weird. What he explained to me was when a plane banks, the nose goes down unless the working surfaces of the plane and the power available to keep it on an even keel are available. And it's fairly obvious that a passenger jet flown by a novice pilot who was mainly trained on Cessnas wouldn't be able to do that. So we talked about the uninterruptible autopilot. And then Field told me something amazing. I can't remember exactly when, but it was fairly early on in our relationship, probably early 2007, or maybe after that conversation in 2006. He said his sister was a powerful bureaucrat. He didn't know much more than that in Washington. And she had called him in December of 1988, asking what she should do in the event of a prisoner mutiny on the plane that they were using to fly prisoners around in what was, I believe, the United States Marshal's prisoner transportation program. And it was a Boeing 727 that I believe Christine Marcy had acquired with funds, I would allege, stolen from or diverted from the United States Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund.
Right.
And he'd explained to her that what she should do to protect the pilot and the crew against a prisoner mutiny on a plane was drone the plane.
Yeah.
And apparently he'd identified a number of planes that would be appropriate, that she could add to the what became known as the Conair fleet. And to the best of my knowledge, having studied this woman in great depth with Field and having Field shared with me his insights about his sister, I believe that Field, unwittingly perhaps, and Christine Marcy unwittingly or even unwillingly, were extorted or blackmailed into developing the Conair fleet such that it could be hijacked electronically in the event of a prisoner mutiny. And of course, that introduces a whole range of technologies, some of which, or many of which, have been patented by companies like Boeing. And so as I proceeded working with Field very constructively, right through to the time he flew out to Malaysia to discuss with government officials and air traffic controllers in Malaysia after the disappearance of MH Flight 370, which was a Boeing 777 extended range aircraft, which has mysteriously disappeared and it still hasn't been found. I think Field and I know where it ended up. We think it ended up in East Ukraine in the crash of what was alleged to have been MH17, but I think Field and I both agree it had been rebadged. Anyway, he goes out to Malaysia and he meets with a man called Matthias Chang, who's a English, well, he's a Malaysian, but qualified as a barrister in the United Kingdom in London, who had developed a theory that he shared with the public at large that MH Flight 370 was hijacked during a Cope Tiger exercise between, Malaysia and the United States and for various other allied air force. So Field explained that the most probable events that had preceded the disappearance of MH Flight 370 was that the plane had been hijacked by the technology, which I don't think he told Matthias that, had been introduced to Field McConnell's sister, Christine Marcy, by Field, and possibly the two, wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, had collaborated to develop the various patented devices needed to take aircraft off their regular en route airway and fly a profile through waypoints to a target. Now, I believe that
David,
software...
Just to clarify, when you say the two collaborated, you mean Field McConnell and Christine Marcy collaborated?
Yes, whether wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, that I can't say. I'd like to think that both of them were unwilling, if they were aware of what was going on in the sandbox, so to speak. And if they're witting, of course, that changes a whole different complex on the events of 9/11. But certainly on 9/11, Christine Marcy was then the chief operating officer of the Small Business Administration with a loan portfolio of about $50 billion that's passed out as working capital to companies that are deemed to be disadvantaged because they're owned by sexually, how should I put it, an alternative lifestyle or ethnicity or birth or color. And what the Small Business Administration has been corrupted into doing is putting together set-asides, which gives these companies a huge amount of loan money at very low interest rates because they're deemed to be disadvantaged, and to set up a company, for example, like Serco's Base One Technologies, which was engaged in the Pentagon upgrade on the morning of 9/11 and would have been in a position.
Wasn't that AMEC that was involved in the upgrades, and Base One was?
Yes, yes.
What was
part
Base
of that
One doing with
Pentagon
the
renovation program?
Oh, Base One.
I'm sorry?
Base One was part of that as well.
Yes, AMEC was doing the upgrade of the Pentagon, the sort of the logistics, the concrete pouring, and all of that sort of thing. And of course, the public should know that Amex Canadian headquarters was at 425 Carroll Street, which you and I visited when we were talking about the Starnet production of hardcore adult and child pornography. Anyway, cut a long story short, I thought, and with Field, that we were making amazing progress on identifying the role of Christine Marcy, who was a charter member of the Senior Executive Service and at one time senior counsel of the Detention and Deportation Program of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and on 911 was the chief operating officer of the Small Business Administration. And Christine Marcy's female partner, nominally she's married to a guy called Eric Marcy, but apparently Christine Marcy's female partner was a woman called Leonara Guaria, who was the chief operating officer of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which had offices in building number 7 on, I think, the 18th or 19th floor. Don't hold me to that particular floor.
But David,
that would have given the two women.
Let me focus you in more specifically on towards the end. We know in a general sense how you and Field got involved. We know that Christine Marcy has been involved in all these other things. There are possible trolls here saying these are theories, whatever it is. We know that Christine Marcy is Field McConnell's sister. She's a bureaucrat. She's had various involvement in a lot of different agencies. I've emailed her. I've called her. I've asked her if she can confirm or deny these allegations from her brother. Certainly the very fact that her own brother has made these statements give them some credibility. I mean, when Ted Kaczynski's brother called the FBI and said, I had information about this, they listened to what he had to say. Likewise, Field McConnell tells you, my sister did X, Y, and Z. It's not like you and I just arrived at this out of nowhere. Field told you that she's involved in various things. Field showed us an email exchange that he had with her as recently as 2018, maybe it was even 2019, where he claimed that she had surrendered. But people really want to know, David, about the split between you and Field. It's been blamed on me. People have said that I somehow bought you or influenced you with money and took you away from Field. Just the other day, Field put out a video talking about how your professional relationship with him was initially you were hired as a writer for his website. And that's a reasonable relationship in my view for him to hire someone to write content that he puts out while he's building a media website is totally reasonable. I also want to reiterate, we're not doing this broadcast to bash Field or create a fight with Field or anything like that. You and I, David, have been very interested in this phenomenon known as social engineering. And social media, we're learning every day, is almost a battlefield for cyber, what do we call them? Cyber militias, cyber forces. Patrick Berge, who's recently been doing a lot of interviews on Crowdsource the Truth, has told us about interactive internet operations and how these things are used to sway public opinion, to minimize the reach of information that is deemed as harmful, like what you've pointed out with this Kinetic North America social engineering protection appliance. So talk a bit about what caused the fracture, what caused you to break from Abel Danger, and how do you perceive Abel Danger now and where you're going in the future?
Okay, yes, absolutely right. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that website was founded by myself, right?
Abel Danger was.
Field brought in resources, some very capable, very people, yes, exactly. And I provided content, and Field and I, right from day one, and he wasn't paying me specifically to investigate Christine Marcy. He was paying me because back then I'm a close to being a pensioner. He's a gentleman, with a big or a reasonably generous pilot's pension. And he felt it appropriate that the work I was doing, he gave me $500 a month, I would guess for probably 4 or 5 years until my late wife passed away. And I was less in need of that kind of money for various reasons. Now, as far as I was concerned, the core research was being done by myself and almost exclusively by myself. What Field could contribute was his enormous knowledge of the flying events of 911 and his ability to communicate or articulate my rather, esoteric theories or technical theories to an audience in the United States. And I felt unless, as far as the academic solutions of what was behind 911, I feel very capable of doing it. What I feel less sure about is communicating that to a lay audience. They've got other things to do, they're in debt, etc., etc. So it was an extremely productive relationship. And we went right to the edge, and here's where I come to the sandbox theory. And I would say it's not so much a split from Abel Danger, it's a drift. I've moved away because the interviews I was having with Field, where sometimes he'd put on a black wig and, make ad hominem attacks on people who weren't Christians or whatever it was, I found that inappropriate to what I wanted to do, was communicate the technical argument of what happened to 911. So I started to drift away, but more particularly that accelerated when Field came back from Malaysia after briefing Matthias Chang and senior government officials and air traffic controllers. And I might just point out that the training of Malaysian air traffic controllers in 1995 was handled by a Serco subsidiary. And at that time, Nicholas Soames, who we've talked about before, was the Minister of State for the Armed Forces in the United Kingdom. So he would have been very familiar with how the air traffic controllers in Malaysia were trained and disciplined and controlled. So back to the split. So we never had an argument, but we had the minds stopped meeting, because I wanted to see, and I don't know quite the procedure in law in the United States, we'd assembled an enormous body of evidence that I think it would have been legitimate for the authorities, the Department of Justice in the United States, where Christine Marcy, was at one time the Assistant Deputy Attorney General under Jamie Gorelick, who was Deputy Attorney General, and Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General. And I might just remind Americans that the Attorney General, Janet Reno, had been alleged to have been a homosexual pedophile abuser, right? And she never sued the guy who said that.
Janet Reno was accused of that?
Side. Yes, accused by that she was. I think she'd been arrested for a DUI about 5 times. She'd been found with an underage girl in her car, and she was basically the boss of Jamie Gorelick, who was Deputy Attorney General, and she's called the Mistress of Disasters for her alleged role in putting stovepipes between the CIA and the FBI in the run-up to 911, which meant the CIA wasn't learning about domestic threats from the FBI and vice versa. So you've got these 3 women at as you run through 911, who put together, I believe, a sandbox, and I wasn't using the terminology back then, that kept various key government departments from communicating with each other, such that they could use that gap in communications to launch an attack on the United States that I believe was intended to overthrow the government of the United States on 911. So anyway, so after Field came back from Kuala Lumpur, where he'd had this interesting visit, he was still doing the routines of saying how evil and bad his sister, and let me just add something, and maybe he can endorse that. He told me that Christine Marcy, his sister, and her lesbian partner, Leonora Guaria, had done a tour of Romanian orphanages where there were very vulnerable children available if one wanted to exploit them. Now, am I being frivolous or vexatious or malicious? All I can say is that's what Field told me. Right? So I started to understand that there were pressures, perhaps both on Christine Marcy and Field McConnell, who had spent many years traveling around in planes and checking into luxurious hotels, where perhaps both of them had been entrapped in what I call a pedophile entrapment network of the kind that I believe was operated in Vancouver out of Starnet Communications that was raided in the 20th of August in 1999. And you and I we had a very interesting little documentary video about Starnet. But when that raid took place, all of Starnet's alleged records of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming in 66 countries was taken away in the 20th of August and a couple of days afterwards and put somewhere. I now believe those systems were installed in 4-star, 5-star hotels where you could actually check into the hotel and download live webcast or podcast or whatever it was of some encounter with a child, that if Americans really understood that, I don't say there'd be riots in the streets, but they'd start to understand the pressure or potential pressure on some of their leaders in
David,
government.
Let me pause you for a
cabinet.
second, because I want to keep you focused on the story of social engineering as it relates to Abel Danger, and I know you're very compelled to reiterate to everyone the overall story, which we do appreciate. But so you're saying when Field came back from Malaysia, there was some sort of difference. I actually didn't know that, because for me, what occurred was when I went to John B. Wells' Operation Classified event in Dallas, Field was there. Several members of Abel Danger, who I didn't know and had never met, were there. There was a lot of animosity towards me from an individual named Craig something or other, who was there, who was trolling me, who was putting all kinds of negative, hateful comments, anti-Jewish comments, just really directing a juvenile and idiotic campaign towards me. And that caused me to turn away, because what they did was they published an article in abeldanger.org, which is the website that you were writing for, that Field was paying you to write for. And there was this very loose organization of Abel Danger as I saw it, because when I was first coming to understand what Abel Danger was and how you guys interacted with one another, etc., I would see tweets from Abel Danger that were like straight up insulting or false about me. And I'd ask Field, what's going on with this? And he'd say, oh, well, I don't run the Twitter account. Or somebody would, post a video making fun of me. And he'd say, oh, well, I don't run the YouTube account, and I don't run the website. And it was somebody else running all this stuff, which to me seemed like a terrible example of operational security. Because if you're going to let any unvetted person run something using your logo, your brand name, obviously it's going to create confusion among the people who associate your brand with intelligent research and good stuff. So when an article appeared on abeldanger.org accusing me of all kinds of things that were untrue and there was no evidence for, I asked Field to take it down. And he told me he doesn't control abeldanger.org, somebody else does. And I asked him, here, we can see right here, from January, we've got a video that's accusing me of being a government LARPer. That's a picture of me right there. But the point is, Field refused to demand evidence to support the claims made against me or take the video down. I said, have them provide evidence or otherwise take it down. He refused. And I found this to be an unacceptable response, because certainly even if Field doesn't control it, the people that control it are very deferential to Field. If he had said to them with some authority, guys, you need to have some evidence to back this up or take it down. Jason's a friend. Jason is on the show. Jason has me on the show. Jason came to Wisconsin to visit me and meet me and further the working relationship. It made no sense to me why he did that. Talk a bit, David, about what causes you to believe that Abel Danger had been hijacked by social engineers, and go into some detail about that if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, both Field and I were more or less technically or technologically illiterate, you see. So I couldn't run that site or set it up and structure it in the way it's been done, which is very professional. So there was a variety of people who controlled the content, and whether or not my arguments were presented in an appropriate way. What I became concerned about is rather the anti-Jewish stuff that was appearing on the page, with which, in a sense, my name was associated. Now, I coined this phrase that Abel Danger is devoted to cloud-centric crime scene investigation, and that's what I stayed with. So this was one of the reasons why I didn't split explicitly, but I didn't like the way that Abel Danger was pointing at particular groups, in case, the Jews and, the arguments about Zionists, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes the presentation I was put in a collage or a picture with those kind of comments about the Jews, etc. So I didn't want to argue specifically with these people, and certainly I didn't have any control over how the website was structured and what was included. And I started to complain to Field. But like you said, he said, well, I'm not responsible for the content that appears. So, I didn't feel comfortable about falling out with Field, but what I noticed is the effectiveness of what I hoped for in the original relationship, where he, bringing his own vast knowledge of flying events, could combine with my knowledge of, let's say, explosives and engineering basics and so on, could communicate to the public at large in the United States that you're dealing with, let's call it what JFK said, the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that goes back years and years. And the only way I could see out of it without having an argument with these people is to leave, basically. And now my ability to explain why I left is, I think that's it. I think they started to focus on ad hominem attacks. They bypassed my logic, which is when you have a criminal event, you look at the events that lead up to it. You don't ascribe the event to your pet hated group, whether it's blacks, Jews, browns, yellows, whites, Christians, Muslims, etc., etc. So I felt I lost, how shall I put it, my ability to steer Abel Danger in a non-manipulative way to communicate my theories of the events of 9/11 and associated, like the disappearance of MH370. And rather having a face-to-face argument, what I found with you is I'm able to articulate that system. And if you just go back to your collage, I think it's just worth looking at the collage there and describing how these kind of social engineerings can get away with you. They can take you to places that you don't want to be. And then you're surrounded by social engineers. I mean, let's just take this guy, Tom Thumb. With great delight, he said in an email to me, did you receive money from Field McConnell to investigate his sister? And the answer to that is, I received money, $500 a month from Field McConnell, right, for perhaps the first 4 years of our relationship, to provide content. That's what Fields were. And Christine Marcy was part of that content. It eventually expanded much more to that, to Christine Marcy's networks, let's call them social networks, if you will, and a whole variety of people who would appear not to be interested in the argument, but interested in denigrating myself, because they say I didn't get a scholarship at Queen's College, Cambridge, or, I shouldn't be calling myself a forensic economist, but they're not addressing the core subject, which is who put together the attack of 9/11. So there's a whole bunch of, and then I did this research into various patents. So I discovered Kinetic, which is joined at the hip. It's a British company with Serco, has a patent for social engineering protection appliance. And if you dig into the wording of that patent, it basically is set up so it can scrub objectionable sites. Well, I think what they were trying to do was scrub Abel Danger as an objectionable site because it was on the path to opening up the analysis of 9/11, which would have led maybe to a whole bunch of people being brought before the courts for wrongful death, I don't know, pedophile entrapment, etc.
Yeah. Well, let me just sort of ask you a few things and clarify a few things. So this social engineering protection appliance from Kinetic North America, you've been speaking about this. This is one of the first things I heard you talk about when I first became aware of you, and it wasn't immediately clear to me what it was, what you were talking about. In many instances, you're speaking about things that are so high level, they're really kind of over most people's heads. So I think there is a bit of a learning curve for people who are tuning into Abel Danger or now to David Hawkins' Reverse CSI, which I should mention we're going to begin in just 30 minutes on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. And just to divert from our main conversation for a moment, David, part of the reason why I wanted to create this method of having sort of a a loosely defined network, if you will, of regular guests like yourself and others who have their own Patreon pages who appear regularly on Crowdsource the Truth, is because I wanted to get away from this type of startup business where I hire people and pay them a certain amount, and then invariably this person says my show is more popular, I want more money, or all these arguments come about. What I thought of was, if everybody had their own Patreon page and we came up with this fairly unique simulcasting approach where we do one video but it plays on your Patreon page and my Patreon page and whoever the guest might be. My feeling was that this created a unique opportunity for everyone involved to earn a living without me being the person who decides what the particular value of any show or any contributor is. It allows individual viewers to become micro-sponsors either of your patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards page or my patreon.com/crowdsource the truth page, or both. And I feel it is a very unique and innovative business model that brings a high degree of fairness to our business relationship. And I don't want you to ever feel like I've got something over you or you've got something over me. I like these very equitable relationships. So that's why we're doing this. But the social engineering protection appliance that you first spoke about well over a year ago, and many, many years ago, this has been reconfirmed and verified by other guests and other occurrences, including most recently Patrick Berge, who actually worked for Dynology, a company started by Barack Obama's former national security advisor, Jim Jones, and may well have been one of the tools used to spy on Donald Trump. We're learning more every day about how government agencies and contractors to government agencies and private companies are able to use this type of technology to spy on us. And certainly there's been a lot of disruption of what you and I have tried to do, David. People in the chat are telling me that this Children's Crusade thing is still happening and that they've got your name on it. And an individual named Timothy Holmseth has recently become involved with Field McConnell, people are telling us. I believe I've seen Timothy Holmseth on that show. It's interesting to note that Timothy Holmseth is represented by Stephen S. Biss, the same attorney who represents Devin Nunes in a lawsuit against Fusion GPS, where Nunes is defending Bill Browder, an exceptional criminal who's been called out by Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and others. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. That lawyer also represents Robert David Steele in a lawsuit against me. So it's very strange for me, David, to observe at John B. Wells' Operation Classified event, this guy Craig, who's always been very disruptive and really unreasonably negative towards me, having never met me and not knowing anything about me. He's actively spread false information about me. He was there, and that was the inflection point where a switch flipped, and he started acting very differently towards me, and his refusal to take down that information that wasn't verified, and his refusal to find any evidence to verify it, caused me to terminate my relationship with him.
Yeah, and of course this is so subtle, isn't it? Because if you're in the sandbox, by definition, you can't see what's going on outside the sandbox. And if people outside the sandbox are connected over those kind of networks, even if they're not face-to-face or, close friends or whatever it is, they can gradually put together a web of distractors, like you're sued for this, or I'm accused of not having a scholarship from Cambridge University, that's got nothing to do with what we're trying to do, but are very effective in absorbing your time. I mean, I feel for you greatly, but you've wasted hours and hours on defending yourself against some of these people. And for me, I think the American people would be far better served if we could slough off these people and focus on solving the number one issue, which, if we don't solve it, represent, in my opinion, an existential threat to the Republic. And people who don't understand that, let me point out, if that fourth plane had hit the Capitol building, you and I wouldn't have this conversation today. So backing up to this social engineering, there's a variety of people out there where I could detect except I wasn't, although I knew the term sandbox, I never thought that I'd be stupid enough to get caught in it, right?
Right.
And then I was just recently thinking, well, when did the sandbox get in place as far as David Hawkins is concerned? And I go back to the time in the 1980s, and I'm working with defense contractors like Raycor Defense Electronics or the Marconi Underwater Systems people. And I realize that the people who control those companies, which include the shareholders, some of whom are shareholders in Serco, may have been watching with dismay as I developed the ground truthing in artificial intelligence, and they decided we got to get this guy in a sandbox. So let's arrange a meeting with Field McConnell. Field McConnell can pay David Hawkins, who we know needs a bit of money, to come into the sandbox with him. And then I don't know if you've heard the phrase, we'll defeat your revolution by leading it. Right?
Absolutely.
So Field becomes an apparent friend, and I genuinely value the contribution he made to me in both financial and understanding the flying events of 911, which I would never have arrived at. From a strategic point of view, the mere fact that he has a sister who he taught or showed how to hijack planes when she's flying prisoners around, to me is a game changer. How many people in America understand that Field McConnell's sister, the co-founder of Abel Danger, where I was providing content, Field McConnell's sister was the person who got the Gore Hammer Award for launching JPATS, Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, which allowed her, using that Lemelson prisoner tracking pattern, it would have allowed her to deploy prisoners into the crime scenes of 911, for example, outside the Pentagon and the World Trade Center complex, and actually deploy different skill sets amongst those prisoners, including environmental cleaners. So they go into the crime scene and take all the evidence away, what I call scrubbing. So I believe until and if, and God forbid they don't wake up in time, but like, the Japanese admiral who said we've awoken a sleeping giant, America should have woken up on 9/11, that was not an attack by some psychopath in a cave in Afghanistan. It was a very sophisticated, layered, coordinated attack from isolated groups who didn't know what each other were doing.
But David, let me keep you focused on the social engineering at Abel Danger and less on the ongoing theory of 9/11, because we discuss that frequently, and we only have a few minutes left to focus on this. Field is now apparently here in the comments, and he's saying that he wants to call in. I don't think we have time to waste with Field right now, but I've said nothing false.
Right.
An unfounded article filled with lies about me was posted. Field refused to take it down. We're not here to argue with Field. He behaved badly. He's consorting with social engineers. There is no doubt that Timothy Holmseth was or is represented by Stephen S. Biss. Stephen S. Biss took part in a $21 million escrow fraud and had his legal license suspended. Stephen S. Biss is named in emails provided to me by Manuel Chavez, and doing all kinds of things that do not seem to me like the type of things that lawyers should be doing. Field had an opportunity to communicate with you and I months and months ago when I had posed the request to him. It was a demand, actually. You got to have evidence or you got to take that down. I'm not saying anything false about Field McConnell. If you'd like to have a conversation with me after the show to straighten this out, we could do it. But until he comes clean on these things, he's not calling in and disrupting this broadcast. I'd also add, David, I received a lot of emails from people who were saying that Field was abusive to you on air, that he was ignoring things that you were saying, distracting people from what you were saying. I don't mean to distract people from the conversation about 9/11. I just want to sort of put that conversation on hold for a moment while we continue talking about this, because in just 5 minutes we're going to wrap up and we'll continue our discussion today on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. So what else can we say about this social engineering situation in Abel Danger? You've used the term sandbox many times. I want to make sure people understand what that sandbox is exactly. We're not proposing that you were actually placed in a children's sandbox with plastic toys, digging around in the sand. What do you mean by sandbox?
And maybe you could just put the original collage up on the screen so we can refer to that.
Sorry, David, before we answer that,
right
I'm just quickly reminded by Winston, who had contacted me about getting you in touch with the Lawyers Commission for 9/11, and I keep forgetting to do that. We've got to do that either this weekend or very soon. The Lawyers Commission for 9/11 wants to have a conversation with you, which I would add, one of the allegations in Swigert v. Goodman, the frivolous, vexatious, and essentially fraudulent lawsuit that the brother of George Webb has brought against me. One of the allegations is that you, David, have been perpetrating a fraud with my cooperation to present some false hope to families that lawsuits for wrongful death could be brought. I think that's totally incorrect on David Swigert's part. I think you have theories and evidence and information that absolutely could contribute to an ongoing lawsuit. The Lawyers Commission for 9/11 Inquiry is actively engaged in multiple lawsuits, and clearly they want to consult with you. They could bring you in as an expert witness. So everything these guys are trying to do is designed to suppress you.
Okay, so let's go back to the question about what is a sandbox. My understanding of a sandbox, and I don't have a background in intelligence, but I can read and infer, is you set up a sandbox beside that which you wish to defend, right? And my argument is that they've created a network for organized crime that is engaged in pedophile entrapment and murder for hire and gaming in 66 countries. And that's the heart of the beast that they want to defend. I come along and I start suspecting that that is the case. They need to park me in a place where they can find out what I'm discovering in real time, if you will, and head it off, right? Divert, distract, decoy. The limit is they could kill me, right? And that's on the table for everyone. But you see, and that question was asked to me in a recent conversation about 2 hours ago. Why don't they kill you? And I'm saying, well, if they think that I'm smart, it's better that they find out what I'm capable of discovering, right? So that they can thwart it, because people are going to come in behind using similar arguments. I mean, the greatest legacy I can have, I think, is this reverse CSI approach to a crime scene, where you go back through the events that end up with someone scrubbing evidence, right? So for me, the sandbox, the tool, the use of the sandbox is to put the people most likely to discover, uncover, reveal, and communicate the conspiracy, and then try and divert and distract them. So they bring up the Tom Thumbs, who's that guy, the agent Serco guy that used to explore
Kevin
my
Marsden,
credentials, etc., etc.
Kevin Marsden, recently back on the scene.
Yeah, the sandbox is to isolate the most dangerous inquiry from the conspirators' point of view from the crown jewels. And I believe one of the crown jewels for the conspirators is that the information technology network of the National Crime Squad in the United Kingdom in 2000 was outsourced to Serco. So Serco controls the information, the data, and the evidence necessary to solve the crime. And at any time, it could actually scrub that data from the record. This is George Orwell, put it down the hole, or deepen the encryption so people can no longer discover it. So I think a sandbox, they've failed. That's why they're mad. You see, when I drifted away, forget any personal attacks. I've always tried, Field I consider my friend, right? But like all human beings, they can be manipulated or deceived, etc. I drifted, or whatever the right word is, away from Abel Danger, because I realized post facto it had been structured or restructured as a sandbox to keep me away from the heart of the conspiracy that includes the people who perhaps are in control of Christine Marcy, Field's sister, and Field himself. I mean, Field has certain needs. He wanted a visa for his fourth wife. Christine Marcy is the former senior counsel for the detention and deportation program of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, could pick up a phone and arrange for Denise to have a visa. Now,
Sorry, David.
the point is we've said a lot of things, and Field has said a lot of things about Christine.
I need to pause you for a second because we're almost
Yeah.
out of time, David. And we're going to carry on with this conversation when we transition over to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I want to send a message to the social engineers who are in our chat right now. Now, there may be some honest people who feel frustrated, David, that you and I have chosen to do this show on Patreon and Subscribestar, but I'm going to say again for the benefit of those people who maybe don't realize this point of view, and also for the benefit of the social engineers, asking me to not put this show on Patreon like Janet Benz is doing right now, you might as well just ask me to end the show, because David needs food and money for food and rent and his day-to-day life, just as I do, just as everyone does. So people who are saying that we're trying to suppress this information by putting it behind a paywall are incorrect. People who are demanding that I put this information out on YouTube should stop doing that, because the reason we do the show on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth is because YouTube is a heavily manipulated environment that these social engineers are very adept at suppressing and deleting channels and doing all kinds of things. Additionally, there's no way for us to do this show in a sustainable way if we're relying on putting it on YouTube so everybody can get this information that they obviously find valuable enough to come over here and demand that you and I spend hours preparing these shows, delivering these shows, spend money on equipment, electricity, rent, all the things that you and I need to spend money on to deliver this information to people. They want us to put it out at our own expense with no income in an environment where it's likely to be struck down and we could get penalized and the YouTube channel would go away. So anyone out there who is an honest person who feels like typing a comment of, oh, Jason, you should make this video for free, they should come over here to my apartment, and whatever their vocation is, if they're a carpenter, if they're a plumber, if they're a chef, they should do their job for free for me. Then they should get on an airplane, purchase an airplane ticket, and fly to Vancouver and go cook David a meal, clean up David's apartment, help him with his day-to-day chores, and we'll demand that you guys do that for free. That'll be a fair exchange. Short of that, I would encourage people to, in just the next few minutes, go over to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and become a sponsor of David's Patreon channel. If you are using a computer, I'm going to presume that it's plugged into the wall and you're paying someone to give you electricity. I'm going to presume that you have an internet service provider that you pay to bring you the internet. Why don't you call up them? Call your internet service provider right now and ask them if there's an internet plan that you can get that's going to save you $2 per month. And once you get that less expensive plan, send $2 a month to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. Send an email to your friends about how great this show is, how important David's information is, and help this network grow, so that we're not relying on YouTube and Periscope and Facebook and all these other networks that we're on, but so we can build this Patreon show so that David and I can keep this sustainable and everybody is on fair and equitable ground. David, is there anything you want to say in just the last 2 minutes before we transition over to the Patreon show?
Thank you very much for making those statements, and I think I'd like people to understand that once you're caught in a sandbox, there's a variety of ways of shutting down your voice. One is to starve you, or bankrupt you, right? Or divert you, or decoy you, or deceive you and your friends, right? Until ultimately your voice goes quiet, in which case people like me, and I'm not saying I'm the smartest guy in town. I think it was Cassius Clay said, never I was the smartest, I'm just the greatest. I think I'm a great forensic investigator of these kind of crimes. And I can take them back to, the Jack the Ripper, and that's another discussion. But I think the Sandbox is a tool that has actually been perfected by people in the United Kingdom intelligence services. And right now, many of our listeners, and perhaps some of the trolls, that are coming in, perhaps in good faith. Maybe they think this is a genuine thing to do. I would say it's extremely difficult to realize when you're inside the sandbox and when you're outside. And I think I'm in a sort of halfway house at the moment. There's still part of me that's inside the sandbox that I would like to think that the people I grew to like and help me are genuine people. And I think I believe that the bulk of them are. But equally, to understand from outside the sandbox, these people can be manipulated, as I was, and I don't think I'm going to be manipulated any longer. The consequences of me being right, of course, for some of these trolls could be like very severe, because the trolls might find that they're associated with the crimes of 911, perhaps unexpectedly, and there will be serious consequences. I'm not in a position to make threats, but you're dealing with the greatest crime in America's history, and it's unsolved at the moment. Over to you.
Thank you for that, David. So we're going to be heading over to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I want to thank all of our generous Patreon sponsors. I hope that some of the almost 700 viewers that we have right now will go to Patreon or Subscribestar right now and join us to help David and I carry on. And one final message for Captain McConnell: if he would like to speak to David or I to straighten any of this out, send an email to truth@crowdsourcethetruth.org or to David's email address that you of course have, and let's arrange the time for the three of us to have a private conversation and work this out. I think we could do a show with Field McConnell if we could sort this out. I'm not saying that we will, but coming in here and putting comments that we're saying things that aren't true is not the way to handle this. David, I'll see you in just a few minutes on Patreon. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Bye now.